All right, so I'm Charles Edge, the Chief Technology Officer of 318, and I'm here to talk about managing Lion Server, a talk I've never given before, having written a couple of books about the product over the last 10 years. Before we get started talking about actually managing Lion Server, I want to give a little bit of perspective about the use cases that I'm going to go through for actually using Lion Server. And in order to set the tone for that, there's a statistic that I'm sure we all know, which is that in 2011, iOS sales outnumbered all Macs ever. So of all the all the Mac computers that were ever sold in 2011, the number of iOS devices was greater, which is a pretty considerable shift. And a lot of those devices ended up in the classrooms that a lot of us manage. And that's led to a pretty big impact on Lion Server and how Apple perceives that we're going to use it and how we actually use it in the field. And one of those ways is, I think I read on the Twitters that there were a bunch of people commenting that someone said that the device is content, right? Anyone in that session? Or So Lion Server is there effectively to put the content in the hands of the students. And it's there to allow the educators or the teachers or the business unit managers to control how that content is perceived. And that's kind of the use case that I'm going to be talking about, as opposed to using Lion Server in a big IT type of scenario. And that's kind of a new way of thinking about a server for those of us crusty old administrators who have been doing this for a long time. You know, I think I hear a lot people asking if Lion Server is still a viable product, but I hear that from people in IT. I have yet to ever hear an actual educator or an actual consumer who asks that question. And one might argue that they're not educated enough about the products to ask that, but at the same time, why not cater to them, I guess, if that's the pool of people that you're kind of winning with in the market, if you're Apple. And so is Lion still viable? I would argue that it depends on what use cases you're talking about and who you are. And it also depends on who's asking. One thing that comes up is hardware. Anyone remember these? You know? Who wants these? So Lion Server might not be for you guys. We can... Yeah. I guess we could end this session now since everyone raised their hand. But at the same time, you know, we have a lot of skills that we've developed over the years for OS X Server, many of us. And we'd like to think that those carry forward somehow. So that was then, and this is now a new era of that, which, you know, the Mac Mini server, for any faults it may have, outperforms an Xserve by far. In fact, I would say the 3 Xserves with the promise rate attached or what have you is still probably not as fast as one of those little minis if it's maxed out. And that mini server is great for some people, but it's not great for everybody, I guess. One thing that we have to keep in mind is not to shoehorn it into places it doesn't belong. But having said that, I thought I'd show you a picture of my apps. No one believes that. Good. Actually, this is a picture of Greg Nagel at work every day. Thanks. The significance is twofold. The first is I've put 350 users for Profile Manager and Manage Preferences on a single mini. And it worked great. It worked fine. I'm not saying that I would put 350 users' home folders on there as well, but in terms of just running Manage Preferences or just running profiles, it's a pretty substantial solution. It's not as good as some of the other things on the market, but it's pretty good for the price that it comes at, I would argue. And then the second is that this movie kind of portrayed 300 people doing something that 300 people shouldn't be able to do. And it was a very specific use case that they were able to do what they did. and that would not, parlay into different environments. So the Mac Mini server, in other words, is great for certain environments and not great for others. One thing that there aren't any slides for is the Mac Pro, because we haven't seen any new stuff there, and whatever. So when you're presenting and when you're writing, I think it's important to try to tell a story and to try to make that story compelling to your audience. How many people in here are in IT specifically? And how many people are educators? And when I say educators, I mean people who actually teach. So I would argue that the Mac Mini server is a great classroom server. I'm not arguing that I would use it in an IT-centric scenario by any stretch of the imagination, but it's pretty good at podcasting. It's got a pretty decent wiki engine. Students and faculty can instant message with each other. And of course, people can share files. And it can hook into any existing directory service and just work like a charm. And it's pretty easy to set up. In a lab environment, Profile Manager, Open Directory, pretty straightforward. Deploy Studio is pretty easy to roll out on these things. And I would argue that overall, they're pretty easy to be instructor managed or educator managed. And those of us who are crusty old IT people might be like, what? Let the teachers manage the server? What if they enable DHCP or something? And that's where tools like Puppet in my head come into play. If someone enables a service that I don't want them to enable, then from a centralized console, I'd like to be able to shut that down pretty quick. Or keep it from happening, as the case may be. And this is up here because anything that I say for the Mac Mini server, I would argue is almost, in the classroom server type of environment, true for a MacBook Air sitting on top of, for example, a cart on wheels. So in this new paradigm, if this is kind of where this is going, what is IT's job? So who wants to take a stab at that? Rich?
IT's job is to help our users do their work and get out of there as much as possible.
That's exactly how I would put it. And my interpretation of that would be, it's our job to build packages and images for them. It's our job, for example, if we want our educators to be able to roll out Moodle, then we could package that up and have it look at the Apache root and drop Moodle in there. It's our job to back up those servers for them, make sure that they're safe, give them a nice sandbox to play in. It's our job to keep those servers secure. So for example, security scanning all the servers, make sure that there's no nastiness on there, make sure that they're following along with best practices. And providing network services. For example, if we want teachers to be able to re-image a server, we might go ahead and do MAC address-based reservations for DHCP so that they always boot to the same IP address, stuff like that. We need to train them on what to do and what not to do. And if it crashes, we need to help them out. And I call this BYOS, which is short for Bring Your Own Server. And I think in order to argue that that's kind of where this is going, Lion Server as a product, it helps to set the stage of where we're coming from. So the prehistory for all you Asimov fans of Lion Server would be Snow Leopard Server. And Apple addressed a bunch of concerns that they had with Snow Leopard Server, one of which was that a lot of people at Apple felt like it was too complicated. Anything that has 4 training courses and a whole certification path is probably going to be too complicated at this point. Everything should be an on-off switch. It should be easy to use, right? So Apple wanted to put everything under a single pane of glass. They didn't want a whole bunch of different tools to manage the boxes. And this is kind of in alignment with most IT standards. Those of us who do ESX or Exchange or things of that nature probably have noticed the same, although not as well executed with Exchange. And this simplifying the product makes it easier to train people, so it reduces the training time. There's no more ACSA, for example. And it reduces the management burden. So the amount of time that we in IT spend managing these things is supposed to go down. And aligning the product to Apple's evolving standards. So on-off switches instead of start-stop service buttons, things of that nature. So the moves that Apple have made with Lion Server kind of back up this concept that, you know, it's a professor-managed or instructor-managed environment. And the product used to look like this. And if you download the server admin tools for now, it can still look like that. Server admin, workgroup manager, there's buttons along the top, there's things on the sidebar, there's buttons along the bottom. You know, from Apple's perspective, this is too complicated. And in Lion Server, it's a single pane of glass. And it's downloaded straight from the App Store, installed off the App Store, easy to get up and running. And really, it's just an app, right? Because servers can be just an app. So from this perspective, some things didn't fit in the new paradigm and have to go away. For example, FTP goes away. Or does it? I mean, you can still access it from the command line. And I think there's a decent third-party developer potential there if you're not interested in Rumpus. And if you don't believe me, I put a big red arrow. That should help. QuickTime goes away, although Darwin Streaming Server survives on its own. MySQL goes away from the GUI, but no one ever used it from the GUI, because if you actually used MySQL, you were probably building it from source and installing it separately to keep within security standards and just to have a modern version of MySQL. And in exchange, we got some new stuff. The biggest new thing is a simple interface to manage these things. And no place is it more obvious that it's simple than when you go to create users, in my opinion. Creating a user is as easy as opening it, clicking on users, clicking on a plus sign, filling in 4 fields, and hitting the done button. And it really helps if you actually don't fat finger the password like I did in that video. Why I didn't retake the video, I just thought that you guys would like to see that I fat fingered PSU of all things, because it's really, really hard to spell. But you can go in there and you can add people to groups. In this case, we created another group as well, and we added the user to the group. And this video, I think, is right around 40 seconds. So creating a user and creating a group in preparation for building a file share is not a very hard process, and it's pretty quick and easy. Who thinks that they could teach a teacher how to do that? I know it's after lunch, and I know you're all tired, but come on. I know for a fact I can, because I have many, many times now. Not dissing teachers. I love teachers, and they're smarter than me, just so you know. So another thing that, that's extremely common out of the box that we do immediately is enabling file sharing. This is pretty straightforward as well. Whoa. Doesn't help when my finger's on the button, does it? So in regard to enabling file sharing, we've got a nice toggle button. We turn the service on. I like to, while I'm waiting for these services to start, rotate my cursor. Does anyone else do that? Am I the only one? Yeah, it does make it go faster. It's like when my dad used to say having a cigarette made the food come faster at the table. Of course, that was back when people smoked. In this case, I forgot to rotate, which made it take longer. So anyways, we just created a SharePoint, and we added that group to the SharePoint. So effectively, if you have a Mac reservation for the server, you boot the server, you open server, you do this, you pretty much have a server up and running as a file server in about, what, 5 minutes, according to how big the image is. It's pretty straightforward, pretty easy, and anyone can do it. It's whether it's a home server, etc. A service that I'm not advocating using in a classroom probably is the Time Machine server. Time Machine server effectively creates a SharePoint called backups, and then all user data that you tell to backup through Time Machine goes into that backups folder. It's got a very simple setup interface. If anyone doesn't believe me, you open it, you click Edit, you choose the volume that you want to back up to. Hopefully it'll be greater than 13 gigs free, which is all I have. But that's it. It automatically toggles itself on after you're done rotating your cursor to keep up with the little spinny wheel at the bottom. Now you've paid $1,000 for a, what's that? And how much are those? So it doesn't seem like a very good deal, does it? But you know, if that's what you want to use it for, I guess works for me. But you do get this nice little command line interface for backing up and restoring user data, for example, as part of an imaging workflow. TMUtil, it's pretty easy to use. It's well documented. I've written a couple of articles on it as well. It's one of the more straightforward command line tools that they have, I think. And then there's podcasting. Does anyone use Podcast Producer? Anyone use the podcast service? I like it. Whether or not it's going to be around in the future is a whole other story. But the problem that Apple had with Podcast Producer before Lion is that it was really complicated. I can definitely say that when we did Podcast Producer or do Podcast Producer setups for our customers, it ranges anywhere from 1 to 30 days worth of setup time according to how complicated the workflows are. Apple didn't want that anymore. They wanted it to be a 5-second install process like everything else. So the podcast service was born in Lion Server. It has no frills. There's no Xgrid. There's no NFS or shared storage. There's no Kerberos. You can put it on shared storage, but you don't have to. Kerberos was probably the hardest thing to get working for a lot of environments for Podcast Producer. That isn't even required anymore. You don't have to monkey around with any permissions. And most importantly, you don't have to learn Ruby in order to make custom workflows. And the other most importantly thing is Open Directory is optional. So any directory service tie-ins are not required with the podcast service. In the documentation it says they are, but it works fine without it. And Apple introduced a new tool called Podcast Publisher, which we can use to upload those podcasts that we capture from our client machines to Podcast Producer. The really cool thing that Podcast Publisher added was there's a trim function. So the act of opening the capture tool and closing the capture tool doesn't show up in all of your podcasts, which is, you know, kind of nice. In other words, it's got remedial editing capabilities in it. And it's one workflow. So whereas with Podcast Producer, we could make 50 workflows, have remote cameras capturing things, a lot of football practices, unlike Penn State, captured that way. But it's really easy to set up. All you do is you open the server app, you click on the on. I'm not used to this remote, sorry. You open the server app, you click on the on button. Maybe you delegate administration to some other users, maybe you don't, and maybe you choose to restrict who can see the podcasts, and maybe you don't. Can anyone do that? Do you think you can repeat what I did in the video? You have to make the spinning cursor thing, by the way. That's a requirement. Otherwise, the service doesn't actually start. One big tip I can give you, when it says Manage Library, if you click on Manage Library immediately, it's not going to show you anything. It hasn't actually finished. It's got to take another minute or two to do that. And I'll show you what I'm talking about when I get to the wiki service. If you used Podcast Producer or want to use Podcast Producer, it's still there for now. But the podcast service is a lot easier to set up, and I think appeals to a lot more of the classroom server type of environments. And it's not just new stuff in Lion Server. There's also a lot of the old stuff that got new ways to look at it. Open Directory was one of those. In Open Directory, we kind of refer to an OD master as network accounts. And you can see this when you go to enable it. In this case, I'm just going to check my IP. I still don't. Does anyone use that next steps bar in the server app? Know what I'm talking about? I don't trust GUIs for the most part. So the setup process, you say manage network accounts. You give it a dir admin account. This is the information that gets dumped into the SSL certificate, and then you hit setup. And I forgot to spin my cursor, so it's going to take a while. But right now it's doing all the slap config processes in the back end, and it's pretty easy, right? I mean, not that the GUI was ever really that hard to use in server admin to promote an OD master, but this is about as easy as it can get, I would argue, considering the fact that you need a bunch of this stuff in your SSL certs. Rich?
I remember something before, once there was at the MacAdmins conference where the URR said that we should probably have dir admin accounts, like dir admin account names for each OD server.
Right.
Because, I can't remember exactly.
Yeah, I don't remember if that was me or Eric either, or Eric. But the reason for having unique dir admin accounts would be that in Lion server, every podcast producer, or not podcast producer, but every profile manager server, iCal server is an OD master. And so you end up with conflicts if you have dir admin on all of them. So iCal dir admin, in this case I did 318 dir admin, but the whole multi-master thing I think is still flushing itself out in locales as well. So, but yeah, I agree with that. The other thing I would argue with this specifically, and this is one of those places where I think IT needs to help the educators who are using these classroom servers, is that that when you promote an OD master, it nukes and paves your SSL certificates. So if you've generated a CSR and obtained a third-party certificate at the time that you promote the OD master, you're going to lose that information. So you want to generate your CSR and import any third-party SSL certs after you promote to an OD master. But I don't think in classroom type of environments people are going to be doing that unless they have a campus-wide wildcard certificate. So, so anyways, Open Directory, we're now running as an OD master. It took about a minute minus how long it took to start. One point of information, while it's thinking and starting all those services, when we hit the on button, don't do anything. It can be frustrating to sit there and watch it, but that's why I started following it with the cursor, is because I kept trying to click on things and move to the next step. Sometimes it'll let you, but it won't commit the change, or it'll commit the change halfway. And that becomes pretty problematic when you've got corrupt users and stuff. So the next service is NetBoot. Is that the right icon for NetBoot? I know. So with the NetBoot service, what do people use it for anymore? Right. So that's why it didn't get its own icon. People just use it for imaging, mostly. Anyone actually using it in production in a lab anymore? Like running a lab off of it or anything like that? We have Rich. Is that because you can't have an internal disk or something?
No, well, close. I'm not running a lab off of it, but we do have about 3 different diskless utility disks.
Mm-hmm.
For 10.5, 10.6, 10.6. Those have been really helpful.
So utility disks,
yes,
which theoretically, eventually you'll just hack the recovery partition and that'll replace that. So that's kind of what we're doing already. Yeah, really it's used for imaging. And in the new versions of SIU and Deploy Studio both, it becomes a little easier because it's dropping it where it goes, and people are building automator scripts for that and stuff like that. But the NetBoot service, I don't really cover because I don't consider that to be much of the classroom server side. I consider it to be more of the IT side. And also, our friends at Jamf have replaced that with VMs that you can run in ESX. Anyone doing that? running any of the Jamf VMs to replace the netboot? Kinda. We've had really good luck with it. If you're looking to get rid of OS X Server on the IT side and move it to more of a productivity server, then that's not a terrible idea. And then there's the web and the wikis, which is, I think, one of the more productive services that it can run. These come with nice built-in shiny web portals that look something like that, where your students or the people in the companies that you support have one pane of glass or one single pane of glass to go to see the content. The wiki is not a terribly complicated service to set up. You click on the on button, and maybe you choose to decide that only certain people can see the wiki. Maybe not. You follow the cursor, and then you're done. Now, what I was talking about with the podcast service, if you see that, it's not actually done setting up the service. But if you hit Command-R and refresh a few times, eventually it'll actually come up. And I know that because this is a video.
And you watched it before.
And I watched it before when I made it. And then again, and then again. With this service, I actually went in a little bit. When you log in to the web portal, you can create wikis just by clicking on the little plus sign. You can also create new pages and upload documents. I'm going to name this wiki, How Awesome is PSU MacAdmins? How awesome is PSU MacAdmins? I agree. I think there would be more enthusiasm if it weren't like an hour after lunch and all that lunch is kind of settling in. And if I were doing better, that would help too. It's a WYSIWYG editor. It's pretty straightforward. Students and educators alike, I think, would be very appropriate to manage it. There's the features for customizing the look and feel are pretty much gone in Lion. I'm not going to say that they'll come back in subsequent releases, but I would hope so. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and add permissions. If I was anchored into an OD or an AD environment, I could just type the name of the group and it would pop up in a list and I could add it as well. So if you're bound to AD or OD, all of this stuff just works with AD and OD. If it's in server app, there's really no further customization that you have to do. There's no manual creation of service principals and things of that nature. And that's it. I also wanted to point out that we enabled the blog in this case, so teachers, students, et cetera, can go ahead and have user-generated content of that type. So then there's network services. So who runs NAT on OS X server? No way. What's great is NAT hasn't changed a bit since 10.4. So you don't have any learning curve to move to Lion. Well, there's one exception, S2S VPN, if you happen to use that. Did anyone ever use that? Ever? You tried. That's because it didn't work. Just saying.
With the built-in VPN on.
Yeah. But the site-to-site that you would create if you had two NATs is the S2S stuff. But that never worked. So I would argue never use NAT in a classroom server type of environment. In fact, I would create a puppet factor and disallow it effectively. XGrid. So if you didn't raise your hand for Podcast Producer, you're not going to raise your hand for XGrid. So we're not going to talk about that. Radius. Did anyone ever use that outside of their house with an airport? Do you still use it?
Still got it running. Yep. Still. Yeah, I thought the to-do list would stop doing that. Why do you recommend using it? It's just for radius, and it does work. We use it with third-party APs.
I wrote some articles on how to use it with Cisco's, for example. Yeah, it works, but I don't think that that you're going to find support for it for long. So, now this you will find support for pretty much till the end of time, I think, with OS X Server. Who's used the OS X Server mail service? Now, for a classroom server, I'm going to say don't do that. However, in production, yeah, 4 or 5 people, maybe you use it. No, no problem. It's no Exchange, it's no Google Apps, but it gets the job done, and there's no licensing cost, right? So, whatever. DHCP, probably a lot more people have used the DHCP service, right? But in a campus type of environment or an enterprise type of environment, you're probably not using DHCP. And as I kind of tried to state in the beginning, I'm trying to lay the foundation for a classroom server and not necessarily an IT server. Now, DNS becomes a weird thing because you need DNS to work well, and sometimes you can't get it from your upstream provider. So you might need to run it. So I made a differentiation, DNS for clients to access. And in a classroom server environment, we're going to not use that either. So is there a bright future for network services in OS X server? I didn't give them any icons, so I would argue no. They just got the service name, no icons. Mostly because they don't make icons for those, but that should be indicative of the fact that there's no love. If you do want to know more, though, I wrote a book about it, and you can buy that. So software update server, I guess I'll cover that. It's still in server admin in Lion. You can get server admin by downloading the server admin tools. It's got 2 or 3 checkboxes you check, and then you save and hit the start software update button. And that's it. One recommendation if you are going to use the service and haven't in the past is you just walk away and you come back tomorrow, because it's going to take a while to cache all the information and updates. And that's it for software update. Now, for patch management, including Apple software updates to a large degree, I think a lot of people are looking at other tools. For example, Greg Nagel with the abs. He wrote this pretty nice tool called Reposado, which we've gotten running in Linux and IIS. It is what it is purported to be, which is an Apple software update server replacement. But Apple software updates aren't all that we need, and there have been how many sessions on Monkey and Puppet here?
2 tomorrow.
2 more tomorrow. And it's come up many times, I've noticed, as well. So I'm not going to talk about that. And then there's all the third-party stuff that you pay for, like Casper, Absolute Manage, which I haven't heard anyone mention, FileWave, which I haven't heard anyone mention in years. Oh. Good for you. I like FileWave. The whole concept of file sets and going back to the Radmine days.
Yeah, I don't actually manage on my campus, but it doesn't work well.
The thing I like about FileWave is you can push out a file set and you can then activate it later. So if I know I'm going to be doing an Office deployment, I can queue it up effectively. It's kind of a nice feature. It also makes rollback easy. If you screw something up, you can pull it back and push the right thing out, I think. So the reason I mentioned those third-party tools is to say that we can do that, not to say specifically not to say that we would run those in classrooms, though, right? Those are more things that we would run in the IT side of things than the distributed computing model side of things. So all these on-off switches, does anyone feel like I've managed to make a proof for my geometry theorem that we can bring your own server? Or have I failed miserably, stinkingly?
Yes, anybody can run it, but what's a use for that kind of thing? Why would I want to give a faculty member access to run their own server?
Do you have Blackboard or Moodle?
Yeah, we have distance to desire to learn.
Yeah.
It's managed centrally. It's gigantic. Everybody uses it.
There you go. You wouldn't. Potentially. Maybe you would, though. I mean, when it comes to podcasting and things like that, I mean, has anyone looked at doing a campus-wide video lecture capture system?
Yeah, that.
And how much was it? this is
$1,000 per room.
right. This is $30. You know, I mean, the cost difference is substantial enough to warrant the potential for middleware development to make it viable, I would argue, if that makes sense. Assuming podcasting survives in subsequent release versions. I would argue that in a bring your own server type of scenario, that the job of campus IT would be similar to the job of a consultant, and maybe that's just me projecting the fact that I'm a consultant onto you guys. But, but I would argue that we're there to provide a safety net. We're there to provide the network services, the backup, the protection that keeps them from doing things that they shouldn't. And I would also argue that over the last 10 or 15 years, a lot of us have probably elevated our skills to the point where we're working with scripting and Puppet and things of that nature so that we would be better suited to be developing mass management tools than to be doing day-to-day on-off switch toggling. A lot of the scripts and the middleware that we do as a company is along that line. So we provide guidance, we stand back, and we let the teachers teach, and we let the students learn, and the business units transact, and maybe help them to learn from our trial and error if they listen, but if they don't, then you know, they have a small learning curve. But I do think that in a distributed computing model that is, you know, BYOD, BYOS, whatever, that we're starting to transform things to a certain degree. Innovation. Who in the room's thought about writing an iBook or writing a book through iBooks? That's a small number compared to what I thought it would be. I sat in on a session from Apple that was all teachers, and everyone in the room was working on an iBook of some form. So I kind of look at this as being almost an extension of that, if that makes sense. But it's not for everyone, I would definitely argue. And if you still look longingly at the Xserve, then maybe it's not for you. But at the same time, if you still look longingly at the Xserve, maybe you have to stand back and think about where you're going next, you know? I'm not looking at you for a reason, by the way. Anyways, I gunned through it. 115 slides in 37 minutes. That's kind of silly, isn't it? But thanks for sitting through it. There's my book again. That's supposed to be kind of, you know, subliminal, by the way. It's not subliminal anymore if I say it, though, right? So, anyways, Q&A. And I wanted to get to this as quick as possible because I think that's kind of the big thing. Yeah.
Just really a comment, though. It almost seems like a lot of the stuff that we're hearing these last couple of days is that Apple's getting out of enterprise. And what you're used to as an enterprise tool is no longer to be thought of as an enterprise tool and use it in the classroom. And I mean, that's what I see.
I'm shaking my head. I mean, I would argue that Apple is an enterprise company for a few reasons. A, they're an enterprise. They build tools that they use internally. They use Open Directory, you know. I would also argue that they're an enterprise company in the sense that they write APIs and command line tools that we in the IT field use. But high density rack mount storage, they're not in that market anymore, period. Unless you're building 2 post racks full of mini servers, and then you're in a management nightmare potentially, you know. But they're building a utility server that I can use at home, et cetera. I do wish that by extension of that they would build an iTunes server, iPhoto server, and make it a true home server, you know. But whatever, we'll see if they ever get to that. But I'm not going to say that they're not an enterprise company because they build dsconfig AD so that we can all bind to Active Directory. They build managed preferences so we can manage our machines in a distributed model. They built Profile Manager so that we could manage machines and wipe them. You know, I think they enabled full disk encryption in Lion. You know, so I would not argue that Apple is not an enterprise company. I would argue that Apple has moved to the point where they're accepting the fact that they're not an enterprise server. And that's okay, you know. That's kind of the point of I mean, I've given a how to use OS X server presentation 100 or 200 times. I couldn't just do it again, especially since it's so easy. You just hit the on button and it works. And you bind first and it works. So, you know, I decided to put a little spin on it, and we'll see if it was okay. Yeah?
Another comment, which is that based on my experience of working with faculty and everything from their own devices to introducing mobile devices, I don't think I can teach a majority of them how to use that, and I don't think it's my issue. I think that maybe 10% of the faculty who are under 40 can be shown how to do
See?
this. I think about 1% of the faculty over 40 can be shown to do this. And it's not even on the question of technological ability, but a concept that a majority of teachers have, that they need to know what minimal technology they have to know to teach their classes, and they try to minimize what that is and to say, no, it's your job to deal with the technology. It's not my job to do that at the beginning of the semester.
And I could...
in that context, I think saying that you can teach people to use these mini servers in the classroom is not realistic.
I can tell you that we have done this probably 100 times now, and a lot of one-to-ones and carts on wheels predominantly, so a very K-12-esque. But this is where Apple is going. And if OS X server, if you take anything away from this class or this session, it's that this is, if you're going to continue using OS X server, this is what you're going to be using. And it's a great solution for that. But if you need high density, you know, VMware ESX clusters, the licensing model is not going to change. It is what it is, and you know, you can do this or you can do something else. And there's a bunch of sessions here on to do something else. You know, I would like to think that we're all very smart and we can figure out a way to make it work without shoehorning it into somewhere where it shouldn't be. And really distributing servers, whether you're controlling them through Puppet or whether you're allowing the educators to control them, is pretty much the only way that this would remain viable in that market, I would argue. So, but I totally get what you're saying, and I would go a step further and say in certain districts they would file a union grievance if you tried to roll out something like this. You know, so I can definitely accept that. But yes, ma'am.
Well, I guess like building on what you were saying behind me as far as Apple kind of changing their model, I mean, at least in higher ed. Like I'm with him, my faculty has no interest. They want to walk in and kind of work. Is Apple leading and hoping that, I maybe can't speak to this, but are they hoping people will follow? Or is there another market out there?
Apple,
just not tapped into?
I would argue that what Apple does is they say, this is what we have. You can use it, or you can bite us. You can go to hell.
But,
you know.
are there a lot of people using, like asking for this and using it? Like,
We've done this specifically more than 100 times. Like I said, very specifically, it's been it's been specific use cases. It hasn't been, you know, a campus-wide initiative or something like that. But I mean, I can actually go a step further and say over the past 10 years, we get called in when teachers buy servers and don't bother to tell the campus IT that they did so. And we've been setting this type of model up for a long time. I think I'm just trying to legitimize it because it's kind of, you know, if you're not down with this, then maybe you need to look at other stuff. And hopefully that's of value, you know, as an argument. So you're closer. You had your hand up first, so I'll come right back.
I just wanted to make a comment. In a way, depending on how you would sell it to, you know, freeze it to them, you're just, it might sound better letting them know that you're empowering them, you know.
Hopefully that message was not lost. I do feel that's the message that I wanted, you know,
That's
yeah.
what it's about. They can feel empowered, they feel like they don't have to interact and deal with IT support for getting these things done. Some people will receive that, some won't.
Yeah. And it is what it is. I mean, if you've already invested gobs and gobs of money into a lecture capture system that costs 30 grand per classroom, then I doubt you want to even think about this because you've already invested gobs and gobs of money. So it is what it is. And I was actually pointing at you. No offense, Julia.
We do use podcast producer much. I can see you have, there's the Apple server that has its own wiki, its own podcast. But we also have the current servers where we don't use the local servers. Podcast publishes the podcast, but we send it to iTunes public and private.
Yeah.
Is that piece still in this client server?
Yeah. Yeah, Podcast Producer is what that is. So Podcast Producer is an awesome Python script, effectively, that hooks Podcast Producer up to Apple. And that is still there. In fact, if you were to just do an in-place upgrade, chances are it might work. I would snapshot it first or clone it first, but that's there. It's just, there's a second tool, and almost in a completely different backend that second tool has, that allows you to do other stuff as well, or that's a lot simpler. Because when you had your deployment from Podcast Producer, you had to have professional services come in and do it, right? Or did you do it yourself? Oh, you did? I think
we had to have an Apple engineer
Yeah.
today
Yeah.
because you have this list that goes down, but if you follow that list in that order, it won't work.
Right.
But
Yeah.
go here and then there, and they come back.
Even if you follow that list in order, sometimes it doesn't work. I mean, it's a very complicated thing. I would argue that Podcast Producer was Apple's hardest service to set up. And it still is if you're going to do a full-blown Podcast Producer deployment, because there's Kerberos, there's shared storage. Like if you're going to do a large deployment, you need to know XSAN or have a NetApp or an EMC array behind it. It is a very complicated service. You have to know a bunch of other things in order to be able to even touch it. And then on top of that, there's all this weird Ruby stuff and iTunes U. There's a Python server effectively in the middle. It's not easy. But in Lion, Apple's like, oh, we'll just make it like that. The thing is, though, there's no XGrid engine, right? So you have to do a distributed model if you're doing lecture capture and stuff like that. Of course, you also aren't watermarking and all those other things the Podcast Producer was doing. Yeah. I said I'd come back to you.
Yeah, I just have a question and an observation. I look at a lot of the publication stuff that Apple's been doing. The iBooks author, whatever that's called. We usually make some pretty nice interactive stuff from what I've read. The iWorks, everything they do, they allow you, it seems like they're allowing you the simplicity of doing this all yourself and making it look really nice. And then I get to the wiki engine, which used to be great, and now you can't change a thing on.
Right.
And I don't get that.
So there's two things behind the wiki thing. I would say, A, here's what we have, use it or don't use it.
Yeah.
And B, they'll probably introduce that back in the future. But they were making some fundamental undercarriage changes that required them to just do whatever they did to get it out the door in Lion. But in subsequent releases of OS X Server, I would expect customization to be back. Personally.
Hope you're right.
Yes?
So in your paradigm, you're rolling around in your own paradigm. How do you see collaboration happening between servers?
That's a freaking awesome question that I should have addressed in the slides. The way I see that happening is you've got Blackboard, you've got Moodle, you've got something like that, right? All we're doing in the wiki service is generating an RSS feed. So your Moodle, your Blackboard, whatever you're using campus-wide becomes the aggregator of that content. So we're creating content in a very localized sense, and then there's another solution that's aggregating that content.
So do you see like an OD master for users and replicas for all your servers across the rooms, or do you see each one being an OD master and having different sets of users?
In a multi-master scenario, they're all going to be OD masters, pretty much. But they can all also obtain user credentials from a upper tier. And as far as what that upper tier is, as far as the services that are managed from server app, we don't care anymore. If it's AD, if it's OD, everything is a dual directory. Everything's a golden triangle pretty much now. So bring your own directory service.
So I'm actually also an Apple consultant. So when you deal with customers that have pushback, you say, I hired you to do everything.
and you roll this out, and you offer this to them, what is your response to that?
I don't let it go that far. Pre-flight calls. Pre-flight calls, pre-flight calls. I mean, controlling expectations before we, it is what it is, and this is what we're going to do, period,
If you wanted to deploy something like this, how do you get around the fact that, at least in my location, classrooms are shared by dozens of different faculty. There's really no, this is your classroom. You will always teach in this classroom. That's not the kind of model that
I would argue that it, yeah.
kind of get over people stepping on each other.
Yeah, then it would be departmental or it would be professorial, I don't think you'd give ever a TA, a Mac server, but I would argue that at that point it would be more on the faculty side that you'd be managing it by. So instead of, it being room X, it would be, because yeah, in a higher ed at least, you're practically never going to have the same teacher in the same room twice in a day, right? So yeah, I would say departmental or sub-departmental or what have you, or faculty-based. It's not a great argument, but then again, I don't know if there are great arguments yet for what the future is going to hold for this. So, Rich?
Well, to follow up on that, maybe in this case, you have the server for the class, but the server itself doesn't have to be the class.
Well, with iTunes U, that's what we always see is it's by course specifically, but you're not going to buy a server for every course. So, yeah, it's, I would say it's based on the logic of the organization, effectively. Yes, sir.
Okay, so,
the lone educator in the room. After lunch, no one raises their hand, just saying.
So let me tell you my favorite thing that I ever did on Snow Leopard server, and just tell me how hard this is going to be to replicate online server. I think the answer will be that it will look exactly the same. An intranet site for teachers only running on the Xserve. It's got confidential documents in it that they can look at, and it authenticates against the same directory, the directory master running on the same box. And the root of the folder is a SharePoint so that people who are allowed to can put documents into it. And setting it up was really quite easy.
So, yeah, I'll answer your question with a question, if you don't mind.
Yes.
Are you also sharing that folder out via WebDAV?
No, some NAFP.
So then it would take about 30 seconds. That's a very simple use case. The WebDAV's now just a checkbox. I should have probably circled that or something in the setup screen. If you were doing it with WebDAV as well, I would say maybe it would take 10 minutes instead of 5, but yeah, good 5 minutes. You should be able to bang that out. Yeah, it's really simple stuff. Assuming that you don't have binding issues, assuming you're not a .local namespace, assuming you don't have disjointed namespaces in your Active Directory, all these weird little caveats, notwithstanding, which I would argue if it's working now, though, you probably don't have those. So I saw another hand. Or was that a back scratcher? Yes.
I have a server-ish question that's back to the Xserve world that I'm really hesitant to leave. I have a 60 terabyte XAN that with 20 workstations connected directly. What happens in 3 years when, well, probably less than 3 years when it's time to start replacing that hardware, and how well supported?
I have a very good answer for that because we have migrated probably 25 XANs to Mac Mini based XANs as far as metadata controllers go. The Mac Mini with a Promise adapter costs less than half what a Xserve cost. And from a latency standpoint, like how the MSHPIORW is in the logs that tells you what the latency is to each LUN on an hourly basis. You need to learn more about XAN. Anyways.
It works.
Yeah, it works, right? To put it short, the Mac Mini is better than an Xserve in an XAN environment as well. The Thunderbolt port the promise, and I've tested this on it as well. I don't have as good of numbers, but the Thunderbolt port from Promise is faster and less latent than it was using an LSI card in an OS X server, or an Xserve, or a Mac Pro even. I would also say, as a reseller, someone who, not to education, but someone who sells Apple hardware, one of the big things that comes up is, well, I need this rack density thing. You know, I need it to fit in 2Us. You know, 2 Mac Pros side by side, or back before we started doing the mini thing, people would say, I really need it this, and I'm going to leave the product, but it's not this. And you'd say, oh, well, you know, there's 2 products out there that can do that. There's the StoreNext SAN appliance that they have, and then there's Active Storage. And each one is probably going to cost you right around 30 grand to do. Or you can get 2 Mac Pros, a couple LSI cards, and bang the thing out in about $3,000 to $4,000. And every single customer caved on the rack density equation and went with the Mac Pros. No one was willing to put their, and this is across at least 25 customers, not one was willing to put their money where their mouth was, complaining about the form factor. You know, it's been a very interesting transition, you know. But 2 Mac Minis is 1U, side by side. The argument that you don't have a second power supply comes up, but that's why you have 2 metadata controllers. You have a second computer. You don't need a second power supply, you know. The argument that you don't have lights out management, I kind of tried to address with a talk at Macworld I did on using home automation to kind of get some of that lights out management functionality on a Mini. So, but yeah, Mini servers, they're great. Short answer, I should have just stuck with that.
Okay. And I've only kind of a little bit played with the actual console in Lion.
Oh, it's great. You know, your users can now mount and unmount their volumes. They don't need you. Less phone calls. That means more time to either drink beer or write shell scripts, or do both, which is of questionable results. So, also I've found Lion to be way more stable. Every version becomes a little bit more stable, hopefully. I would say if you're using extended attributes, you might need to nuke and pave your volume to get rid of them, because extended attributes have been problematic in X8 environments. So.
Doing with the second hard drive in your Mac Mini servers?
I am not using core storage to mirror them. I am usually using Time Machine or something else to do a clone, and that's that. We keep very, very detailed statistics of fail rates of machines, and we have thousands of machines we support. So I would say the fail rate has been not quite in the triple digits for rated internal drives on mini servers, but not too far from the triple digits, which is.
So JBOD, just whatever it does.
Yeah.
Just for anything.
Yeah, JBOD and then Time Machine or Carbon Copy Cloner or whatever, you know, offline clones.
You may be using one as for file storage, the other one as OS, or
no. No, I still want fault tolerance on a server in most cases. So I'm not splitting the data. But I am using that second drive as a backup, and hopefully a bare metal backup. And then my long-term data backup, I'm using whatever I'm using. But you know, as far as bare metal, I'm still using it for bare metal backup.
Have you had any success with iSCSI?
I've had no success with anything I've ever done in my life, but yes, I've had tons of success with iSCSI.
Even with network homes?
No. I've had very little success with iSCSI for network homes, and I think that, that you should not do that. But I have tried it. So, yeah, I've done tons of R&D around trying to do network homes on, or mobile homes on iSCSI.
Is it using the Atto iSCSI connector?
Atto, Small Tree as well. Small Tree has an iSCSI connector. And also, there have been different targets ranging from EMC Solaris to NetApps to iSCSI targets using open source crap to try to tweak the block size and stuff and make it more efficient. It's not a, It's not viable, and nor is putting home directories on xSANs.
On what?
xSAN. So.
I was going to say, what about with Thunderbolts? What's the Mac?
I have never tried to do a network home over.
And it's, 50 seems to be where.
Oh, you mean, wait, you mean on a mini server or something? No, I thought you were talking about direct attached storage. Yeah, that's fine.
Server, Thunderbolt,
Yeah, I've found that according to what kind of data the users are using, it kind of tops out around 30. So if you're at 50, then you get a golf clap from me. Yeah, if they're small, I'm sure you could go up to 80 or 90, but averaging out or amortizing, I can't imagine it would be that much. You raised your hand, and I like your bushy hair thing that you got going. So, what's up?
Have you had any?
I can't do that, so I have to like.
Have you had any luck resharing NFS online? Because I haven't been able to get that working.
I haven't had any luck on that.
Tried it?
I have tried it, and I haven't had much luck.
And it doesn't work for you either?
Nope.
Okay. So it's definitely something broken in line.
I'm not going to say, I'm not going to ever say that something's broken in line until someone from Apple tells me it's broken, and that's never actually happened. But yeah, I have not had any luck resharing NFS shares, so, of any type. So whether it's coming off a NetApp or whatever. I have had some pretty decent luck, like mounting them through other protocols and then resharing them, but you've got that whole latency thing and whatever. So it's not something that comes up much, believe it or not. But your use case is probably trying to convert NFS to AFP effectively, right? Yeah, yeah. That's been a nightmare.
It works fine in Snowleopard. That's
Yep.
the big holdup for us because I'd like to move the line.
We have plenty of clients doing it there, and most of the people, when I talk to them, we end up talking about Helios or Extreme ZIP, you know. And Extreme ZIP, I've had great luck, you know. Yep, Helios requires Linux, you know, or Extreme ZIP requires Windows. But yeah, we're switching platforms all of a sudden, and we're becoming a little more rack dense. Can't say I blame you. Yes, Julio.
Question or comment. Has anyone gotten an online server VPN working for Windows?
One more time, the acronym.
VPN hosted on a Mac server through Windows without
Yeah.
any third-party apps or anything?
Yes. Well, which one? I mean, PPTP or L2TP?
L2TP.
Yes. I haven't tried PPTP, which is why I asked.
On the
You know.
latest 10.7.3?
Yeah.
Was there hassle involved? Did you have to do tricks or anything?
No. Oh, one thing I did notice is if it was a 10.7.2 box that I updated to 10.7.3, then I had to nuke and pave it to get it to work. Don't ask me why, but when I nuke and paved it, it worked fine. And that I can say is the least enterprise acceptable feature of Lion is the fact that at each update, 10.7.1, 10.7.2, and then 10.7.3, I had to nuke and pave a huge percentage of servers. So over 60% of the servers that we support had to be nuke and paved in order to work again. And that's across Profile Manager and iCal server and some of the other server services that just, you know, they just didn't work in Lion or in 10.7.3 when they were updated.
When I initially tried getting it working, it might have been just that one.
I think it has something to do with the fact that they added the drop-down list to do PPTP again, and they did something weird in the back end. So if you tried it and, yeah.
But the other thing is that a lot of people, I've heard a lot of concern about rack-mounted minis and not having offline access. But there's a lot of companies that make web-accessible remote KVMs.
Yeah.
Basically serve like a rack function, essentially.
In order to power those things down, like at my house, I have about 50 minis now. Don't laugh. And yeah, it's very low. The minis are free. They have almost no signature. And I use Z-Wave to do a lot of home automation. And everyone has its own power receptacle in a weird looking little grid thing that I built. I'll try to put some pictures online. But basically, I can tap into my Vera, and then I can power it down and power it back up. And that's all I really care about, you know. I don't care about looking at the GUI much anymore. And I'm not going to buy a KVM at my house for 50 machines. It'd be, thousands of dollars.
What do you need 50 machines?
It's a Warcraft botnet. Moving on. If you don't have your own botnet, you're just, you're so behind. Yeah, we're not going to address that much. I have a big house. I didn't know what to do with all that space. It's really just decoration. I could have gotten Mac Mini wallpaper, but they don't make it yet. So there's your business opportunity. Anyways, we're at 4. These are hour sessions or? Oh, hour and 15. So let's just keep doing Q&A. Or if there's no more Q&A, okay.
This is sort of unrelated, but we have NetApp filers,
Mm-hmm.
and we have had no end to trouble with every time there's an update on from either vendor, Apple or NetApp. Dropboxes sometimes work, sometimes they stop working.
Sometimes it's really slow, right?
Sometimes it's unbelievably slow.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
intermittently, completely
Yep.
randomly, not tied to machines, not tied to users. The Dropbox is not working is an enormous problem, though, because faculty you're relying on students putting things in there, and they, say it's due at this time, and they have 10 people in their class saying, "I put it in there," and he's like, "Well, I don't see it," and he's like, "Well, I put it there, like I put it
Yeah.
in there," and
I've been there. I feel your pain. At this point, when my customers, when new customers call and they say, "I've got this NetApp and it kind of works intermittently like that," I don't even take them as clients. I'm like, I don't have anything to offer you.
okay, so it's not just us, though.
No, it's not just you, for sure. The biggest thing we see is the latency, and it's not a global thing. Like some people, it works great for, a large percentage. I mean. It works just great, and then an update maybe breaks it, or an update doesn't break it for certain clients, and it tends to follow different workflow patterns with the speed issues mostly. But yeah, it's been what it is. I can say that because we're a NetApp reseller, my account rep put me in touch with engineering, and they just hired a new Mac guy. So I don't think that they were doing any QA testing on the Apple platform before. So hopefully it will get better now that they actually have someone who's doing that.
Has there been any feature requests for AFP on the platforms?
Yeah.
Since you're a reseller, you have
Yeah. We have at least 5 specific customers with well over $1 million NetApp infrastructures who have made those feature requests, and I don't foresee it. I mean, unless some of the open source tools catch up and they can pop it into their custom little Linuxy kind of thing, I just don't see it coming, personally. Having said that, they did just hire a Mac guy, so maybe it'll show up. But as far as I'm aware, he's not a driver coder or anything like that. So.
For what it's worth, we found that Linux server Red Hat connected NFS to a NetApp storage size.
And what are you using?
Saving us SMB and serving us SMB. For our customers.
So you're not even messing with AFP anymore?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Faster than NetApp.
So one of my prognostications that has not panned out is that AFP would go away. I don't know how. It's like it's just hanging on. I'm not dead yet.
You would think by putting more hops in the stereo there, would make it so much more inefficient.
It doesn't, yeah. Well, we found that same thing with putting AFP heads in front of XANs. If we put a StoreNext head in front and enabled one of the AFP ports for Linux, it would be way faster than if we were just putting an Xserve running AFP. I don't know exactly how to feel about that, but it's been a frustration for a long time. And no matter how many TCP dump captures I look at, I just have not been able to offer much,
What do you recommend as using for home directories if not AFP?
ExtremeZIP.
And using AFP?
Yeah, it's great. One of my coworkers, Zach Smith, once said, ExtremeZIP IP fixes every AFP issue I've ever had. And I didn't think about it at the time, but I was like, yeah, it really does. I don't know how they do AFP better than Apple in some cases, but they kind of do. For larger infrastructures, I mean, for 20 or 50 users, I still think the mini server or a Mac Pro server is fine. But
Have you used this for home directory?
mm-hmm. That seemed to be problematic for me. We can talk about that if you've tried it and it's not working, especially on NetApps, actually. Yeah.
This is just to pick your brain. What are your thoughts on ZFS and its use responsibilities?
I don't ever want to hear that acronym again. I'm so sick of that acronym. Here's what I think about ZFS and its possible future in OS X at all. Core storage. I mean, I don't think that if Apple were ever going to do anything with ZFS, that they would have built core storage the way that they built it. So I wouldn't even think about it ever again. So. Yeah. I took out a slide when I was talking about like the problems that Apple was addressing, and GPL3 was one of those. You know, I think as they get rid of all of the code that they think they might someday potentially get sued over, that is becoming less and less of an issue, especially when Sun or Oracle, or Snorkel, as the case may be, seems not in the least bit afraid to sue anyone. You know, they'll go head-to-head with Google over Java. If they'll go head-to-head with Google over Java, then they'll go head-to-head with anyone over anything. So, you know, it seems like enterprise IT is all about lawyers and patents these days. It's not about boots and suspenders engineering, which is regrettable. So.
Any advice for moving 10.6.8 servers to Lion, specifically metadata controllers?
I'm going to say something I've never said. Well, wait, specifically metadata controllers. So for other services, I'm going to say something that I've never said before, which is the upgrade works great in most cases. I've never said that, but in Lion, it's true. I don't know how you guys feel, but I've had great experiences with the upgrades in Lion. For metadata controllers, what I'm going to do is I'm going to promote a client to my third metadata controller, hopefully from someone who's not there that day. I'm going to then fail over everybody so that guy's the master. And then I'm going to nuke and pave my other two metadata controllers. Unless I've got StoreNext licensing or something weird that I need to transfer in a different manner, but that's how I'm going to do it every single time. And then when the two get promoted, I'm going to demote the third, and we're going to be good. And I've had perfect success with that. Anytime I've tried to upgrade, I've had a complete fail. Having said that, there's one thing that comes up, and I think we're looking at something like an 18% fail rate. When you do that upgrade, you may lose your permissions. We've lost all of the permissions on the volume in 18%, something like 18.5% of the cases of the upgrades we've done. And that's pretty frustrating when you have to go and nitpick through. Now, in most XANs, luckily enough, in my experience, most XANs have one permission set for everybody. And that makes it pretty easy. Yeah, not you and not you apparently, but you know. Yeah, well, just be prepared. I would recommend, I would recommend like piping the output of LSAL recursively throughout your entire file system, so that if you get a failure, you can at least look on paper and try to replicate or script a reverse chmod of your data. So we may even have a script for that, I think, because we started doing that and it's kind of gotten us out of a couple problems. So, Rich?
What about the follow-up on the XAN question?
God, more XAN questions than I would have thought. I'm talking about consumerizing servers, and you're asking me questions about XAN. I love it.
What about using your storage solution and getting off of OS X server entirely and just transitioning over?
That's what I was saying. We're an active reseller, and I'm not here to say I'm a reseller of anything, so I apologize. I don't mean to be offensive if that is, but we have yet to have a single customer go for that. They'll buy the active RAIDs, but when it comes to the metadata controllers, it is free in Lion. And every single customer has been like, wait, I can buy 2 minis and 2 promise adapters, or I can pay 30 grand for active. Now, having said that, there are certain use cases where I would be like, you really need to look at this active thing, like hierarchical resource management, data deduplication. That comes more on the StoreNext side than the active side. But I was in their beta class for their metadata controller product, and it's great, but I think that Apple shot them in the head when they made it free. I mean, because they also charge on a client model, and with Xan, it's like, oh, well, I've got 50 clients, so I just saved $50,000. It's a pretty substantial move that they made. So, which I guess you can do, when you're Apple, and you have people carrying gold bars from one part of the office in Cupertino to the other, So I don't, regrettably. I strive to that. Actually, I look forward to running for president like Ross Perot someday, but I need to shave my head first, apparently. Okay, more. Well, we're right on time then. Flowcharts? Yeah, I don't understand PowerPoint. It's really complicated, and I haven't been able to figure it out. Exactly. Yeah. One of the happiest days of my life was when I finally said I'm not making any more PowerPoint presentations and moved to Keynote. So, anyways, thanks for coming. And by the way, more subliminal messaging. Thanks.